5. She had left only a minute after him, but she didn't see her partner at all on the straight path on the main part of town. He must have started sprinting as soon as he'd left. If it weren't for the fact that he would only pull farther ahead while she typed, she would have sent him an instant message. So the only option was to run. But no matter how many corners she turned, she never caught sight of Kirito's back. "Geez, how hard is he running?" she grumbled as the back alley joined the main road and the number of people in the vicinity grew. She looked around, exhaled in relief, and when she spotted a familiar-looking shape up ahead. But she didn't want to yell out to him and draw attention in the crowded place, so she had no choice but to continue her pursuit. Kirito nimbly raced on, avoiding players and NPCs alike, cutting through the teleporter square into the north side of town. When he reached the plaza that contained the entrance to the catacombs, he ran straight into the ruins without stopping. Hey, wait a minute," she called out, belatedly, but he didn't seem to hear. Less than a minute later, she reached the temple ruins and stopped at the descending staircase that yawned from the floor. Briefly, a horrible feeling of anxiety crawled through her chest. But she didn't have the option of turning back now. She opened up her menu, deciding to prioritize meeting up, and sent him a brief message reading, "Wait in the B1 room so I can join you." But the window immediately gave her a curt error message. This person is either in an inaccessible location or is not logged in. What? She gasped, looking up at her left corner, but Kirito's HP bar was still there, a consequence of being in the same party. So, the ominous latter option in the error message was not the case. She sent the message again, just to make sure she hadn't misspelled his name, but the result was the same. The first basement level of the catacomb was treated as inside the town, so she should be able to send him a message. If it hadn't worked, that meant that the span of less than a minute, Kirito had reached the second level, which was classified as a dungeon. It was hard to believe, but there was no other answer. She would have to give up and return to the inn. No! She had told herself she didn't just want to be a person who was protected all the time. If she turned back now, she would never be an equal partner to him. It would be all right. She gained the knowledge and instincts to fend herself in the last 50 days. "I'll catch up to you as soon," she swore under her breath, and stepped onto the staircase. Even at this time of night, the large entry room serving as a base camp for the town's relic hunters was dotted with players, but Kirito was, of course, not among them. She opened her window and checked the map tab. They'd run all over doing quests earlier today, so they map out about 80% of the first level, but there was still some of it grayed out. In particular, they hadn't set foot through the south door of the room. There were no markers for descending staircases in what she'd mapped out already, so if it was anywhere, it would be through that door. She closed her window, crossed the chamber, and pushed the mossy stone door. Unlike with the doors to the north, east, and west, there was no hallway. It opened up onto a small room with another descending staircase in the middle. The second level of the dungeon had to be down there. No wonder Kirito had been able to pass through the first level in less than a minute. As Asuna approached, she noticed a small placard sent to the side. It had a handwritten Japanese note reading, "Not safe haven below. Be warned." It was probably meant to ensure relic hunters didn't find themselves in trouble. For an item, a signboard had a pretty long lifespan, but even that was just 24 hours. Whoever had spent the money on this was probably refreshing it each day, but she was going to ignore that warning. After a final check of her gear, confirmation that her portions were easily accessible from her waist pouch, she carefully headed down the darkened stairs. Fortunately, the staircase was short, and in just 20 steps, she was down to the second basement level. The moment she stepped into the small room below, which was indistinguishable from the one above, a warning reading "Outside Field" appeared. Beyond this point, the anti-criminal code would not protect her. The bluish stone walls, cracked floor looked much the same as the first level, but the chill in the air, on her skin, and the toughness of the stone floor on the soles of her boots felt undeniably different from the floor above. It wasn't her first experience going into a dungeon alone, of course. She'd spent up to 3 or 4 days in a sub-dungeon of a labyrinth tower, the first floor alone, battling constantly, and she was much stronger now than she was then. The recommended level for this dungeon was about 12. Asuna was currently 17. As long as she could handle the astral types and remained no more than 2 staircases from the safety of the town, there was no reason at all to fear. Asuna brushed her bare legs to drive away the chill and began to walk. The little room had only one exit, so she headed through into the hallway. The walls alternated between weak torches that looked ready to go out at any moment and small doors. It was nice to have light at all, but the thought of checking at least a dozen doors one by one was tiresome. But if Kirito was down here to search for Argo, he would be looking through all of them. She was only a few minutes behind him, so the possibility was high that she'd open a door and run smack into him. Perhaps if she shouted at the top of her lungs, he would hear her, but it would only attract the attention of monsters. She decided to search the slow way, walking over to the closest door and listening through the rusted metal before pushing it open. The room was darker than the hallway, lit by only a few candles, set into the nooks of far wall. She didn't see any players or monsters in the narrow room, but there was a rectangular box placed near the back. It would be quite a large for treasure chest, but upon closer examination, she was still wrong. It was a coffin, but of course, this entire dungeon was a giant tomb. Asuna simply closed the door, knowing that nothing good could come from approaching the opening of that box. She exhaled, carefully walked to the next door, and opened it. Another tomb with a coffin inside of it, and no people. She shut the door quickly. The 3rd and 4th floor were the same thing. She had beginning to get impatient, and was ready to close on the 5th door just as fast when she suddenly froze. Something was glowing along the back wall. It wasn't reflecting the light of the candles. The dim white glow was the same kind that emitted in the temple Kerluin the night before. She checked her HP bar and saw that the buff icon on the eye was lit. She had some of the blink and brink's tart effect active. That meant that the source of white light was a relic that hadn't been picked up yet. After a bout of hesitation, Asuna decided to step into the crypt. The relic finding bonus lasted for 60 minutes, so it probably didn't have much longer. It would be a waste to let it drift away without making use of it. She snuck across the 30 feet of crypt toward the back wall. The glowing effect was in a crack in the stone floor, and when lifted up, she found it to be an ancient silver pendant. Asuna wouldn't know what it's worth until it was appraised, so she put it in her pouch and turned to leave the room. There was a heavy scraping noise. Kruk, kruk, like a stone pestle coming from the right. She glanced aside, overcome by an intense foreboding. The instinctual guess of stone pestle was actually not far from it. It was indeed a sound of a heavy stone-on-stone scraping. In this case, the lid of a sarcophagus, as it moved by its body. Asuna clamped her lips shut to lock down the scream and pulled the chivalric rapier loose from her waist. Meanwhile, a glowing humanoid figure was emerging from the half-opened coffin with a wail-like whistling wind. It was very similar to the ghost of vengeful girl from the 30 Years' Lament. The major difference was a pale red cursor hovering over the thing's head. The HP bar contained the name Mournful Wraith. It was a monster, an angry spirit that could hurt her. The wraith wailed, spread its arms, and pounced at her. Even knowing it in the rational part of her mind that it was just data on a computer, she wasn't able to completely overcome her fear. She scurried backward to the right corner of the crypt as she swung her sword at the thing. Her boots landed on a particularly large stone, which receded a bit with a tiny click. Under normal circumstances, Asuna would notice the aberration and leap away, even without knowing what it was. But she was so focused on controlling her fear of the ghost that her reaction to the change was late. Before she knew what was happening, the stone swung downward into a trap door. Asuna plunged through the narrow hole and fell without a sound. Her first thought was the height. In a way, the only thing scarier than a floor boss, universally capable of instantly killing even the hardiest of warrior, was fall damage. It varied based on maximum HP, strength, agility, and the terrain of the landing ground. But even at level 17, if Asuna fell over 30 feet head first into hard ground, she could easily die on impact. The silver lining was that the hole was narrow, so her body wouldn't rotate midair. She just had to pray it wasn't a long fall and brace her feet. The moment she left the hole, she saw a stone floor much like the one on the second level. It had been about a 30-foot fall. She let go of her rapier to brace herself, and when her shoes hit the floor, she bent her legs and rolled. She did 2 backward somersaults until her back hit the wall, stopping her cold. The impact was intense, but her HP loss was just under 10%. She stayed frozen for several moments, making sure nothing else would happen. The trapdoor had vanished from the ceiling above, and the wraith's wailing could not be heard. She slowly let out the air trapped in her chest and rearranged her thoughts. Asuna thought she had conquered her fear of ghosts, or astral monsters rather, but she totally lost her cool and failed to notice that she was wandered into a trap because of it. It was pathetic, but the important thing was to react and recover, then regret her mistake. She had to assess the situation and take the smartest possible action. Her first priority was to return to the second level of the dungeon from the bottom floor. That meant step 1 was to examine her surroundings anew. Asuna slowly got to her feet and looked around in search of the chivalric rapier she dropped during the fall. The silver sword was resting about 6 feet away, but there was also something else there. A humanoid creature with bluish skin, just barely a foot and a half tall, with a rodent-like extended snout and a large yellow eyes glowing at her. The little monster looked up at Asuna and skittered with a mocking laughter. Then it picked up the rapier, which was no longer than it was tall, tucked it under its arms, and darted off at unbelievable speed. "Hey, wait!" she yelled, but that had never stopped a robber before. A little creature melted into the darkness, leaving behind only a cursor labeled Sly Shrewman. If she had let it pull away until the cursor disappeared, she instantly knew she would never find it again. Asuna tore after the thief. As she ran, she noted that her surroundings were less of a man-made structure and more like a natural cave. The only light sources were glowing patches of moss on the rock wall, which made it hard to even see the floor ahead. She'd need to pull a torch out of her inventory and light it to avoid tripping, but that wasn't possible at a full sprint. She just kept running, praying that the luck would keep her from slipping on the uneven, slippery ground. Thanks to the sprint skill she'd replaced her tailoring skill with a few days ago, she'd caught sight amount of silhouette in the darkness ahead. After just 30 seconds or so, the sly shrewman turned back briefly, then skittered again, a bit more panicked this time. "You're not getting away from me!" she shouted, just loud enough for the rodent thing to hear, and leaned forward as far as she could, stretching in an attempt to grab the thief's twitching tail. Her fingertips brushed the tip of the tail, glanced off of it, then finally seized on tight on the third. When her right foot plunged into a puddle, the sole of the boot lost its grip, and her body toppled forward. She was just barely able to avoid the smashing her face into the ground, but she still landed hard on her butt in the water, sending up a large splash. The shrewman darted off. The light pink cursor vanished silently from her view. All Asuna was left was the unpleasant sensation of a cold water seeping into her skirt. It took a full 15 seconds for her to get to her feet. She made it her way to the wall with heavy footsteps, the hem of her skirt and the ends of her hair dripping with water. Once she found a dry stretch of ground, she sank down to her knees. Her sword was gone. Her lifeline in this world, the chivalric rapier +5 that harbored the soul of her old wind fleuret. The loss and fear of that shock bounced back and forth in her mind, impending other thoughts. She needed to regain her wits and take the optimum actions now, but her head felt heavy and dull, robbing her of her ability to identify what she ought to think. Her hand moved slowly in the darkness down to her right side, but the only thing the fingers touched was cold rock, and not the partner who was always with her. Yes, if Kirito were here, he would tell her exactly what she needed to do. He would track down the shrewman through some means Asuna couldn't begin to guess, and get her sword back. Kirito. He did not answer her plea. She looked up at the cave ceiling, lit faintly by glowing mosses. Somewhere in that direction, on the second floor of the dungeon, was Kirito. He might be only a few dozen feet away from her at this very moment. Asuna sucked in a deep breath, preparing to shout out the name of her partner with all of her strength. But when she pulled her lips back to form the k, they were trembling. She wanted to call him. She wanted to scream his name over and over, sobbing like a pleading child. She wanted to cling to the possibility that he would appear out of nowhere and solve her problems like magic. But she was in the bottom floor of the catacombs beneath Kerluin, on the 5th floor of Aincrad. As of December 29th, it was literally the front line of player progress. The monsters here would be more powerful than any seen thus far, and yelling to draw attention to herself without a weapon in hand was nothing short of suicidal. She pulled her hand up and clamped it over her mouth. The urge to scream and cry was overwhelming, but she held it in, letting only silent tears leave her. She was scared. She was alone. She wanted to go back to the town right away. Asuna had never felt the fear like this when she had been alone in the 1st floor labyrinth tower. She worked her gear down to the breaking point, and if she happened to die, then that was that. Since then, her gear and stats had grown much more powerful. So it was her inability to even stand on her own feet, now a sign that her heart had grown weaker. Had meeting Kirito and fighting alongside him caused her to lose that solidarity strength? No. That wasn't true. The only reason that the old her didn't feel fear was because she had given up. The reason she was so afraid now was because she had found a reason to survive and keep living. In fact, Asuna had found a new goal for herself just today, to be as strong as Kirito so she could ask him to be officially friends with her. She couldn't give up on that now. She would make use of the knowledge he'd so liberally given her and return alive. There was no other choice. As soon as she swore that oath to herself, she heard her partner's voice echo in her ears. Kirito had told her about a similar situation once, just after she lost her wind fleuret to that organizing scam, and he'd recovered it by using the materialize all items button. She could still clearly recall his words. So he finds a spot he thinks is safe, then does the material all items trick, dumping all his stuff onto the floor at his feet. The problem is, there are looting mobs in that dungeon. All these little gremlins come pouring out of the woodwork to grab everything off the floor, stuff it into their sacks, and scamper off. It takes him 5 whole hours to hunt down each and every one of those gremlins to get his stuff back. I tell you, it brought a tear to my eye. The little gremlins in Kirito's tale had to refer to the shrewman. He'd acted like it was a story relayed to him by another player, but she figured it had to be first-hand experience. Looting mobs had the robbing skill, which immediately overwrote the owner of an item, so even the materialize all button wouldn't bring it back, he'd claimed. Trying that again now would be of no use. If she wanted her chivalric rapier back, she needed to defeat that shrewman. Fine, I'll do it, she mumbled into her palm, then let go and rubbed her eyes with the back of her other hand. In the red of the sly shrewman's cursor was quite faint, which meant that its combat ability was much weaker than level 17. Asuna, if she had hit with a single sword skill, that might be enough to wipe out entirely. But she needed a weapon for that. Asuna opened up her window and switched to her inventory. She touched the sort button, praying to herself, and organized it to only show her rapier category. With a little sound effect, it narrowed down a display just a single name, Iron Rapier. The very last one of the pile she'd been bought in the bulk in the first floor NPC, and used it up without bothering to have them repaired. She'd been meaning to get rid of it for ages, but never did. She touched the item and select Materialize. The crude wooden sheath appeared above the window. She picked it up and stood, put her right hand to the hilt, and slowly drew the blade out. It was essentially the very bottom tier of that weapon category. The blade dull, the knuckle guard essentially just a sheet of curved metal, but in this situation, it was Asuna's very last lifeline. "I'm sorry I wasn't taking good care of you. Please help me," she whispered to the sword, put it back into the sheath, and hung it from her left hip. Next, she replaced her normal hooded cape with the silver one she was saving. After that, she equipped her rewards from Yofel Castle the day before. On her ears were the earrings of ripples, fashioned in the shape of little shells, with boosting to hearing. And on her legs were mid-length boots with over-the-knee socks called prancing boots. They gave her a slight jumping bonus and diminished the sound of her footsteps. Outfitted in the best gear she had on hand, Asuna looked in the direction of her shrewman's escape. She wanted to go off searching for it, but obviously moving meant increasing the risk of encountering other monsters. It was already nearly a miracle she chased so far after the little thief without running into any other foes along the way. On the other hand, it was not going to show up again if she waited in place. Still, there had to be a way to take advantage of a looting mob's habits to lure it out. Asuna pulled up the map tab and closely checked on her surroundings. She was in the southern part of the third level of the dungeon, which is essentially a straight corridor mapped out from the spot where she'd fallen through the trapdoor. The passage widened where she'd slipped and fallen and seemed to fork just ahead. She had no idea which of the hallway's two branches the monster had taken. Asuna closed her window and reached into her waist pouch to pull out a silver pendant that was the original cause of her fall. She didn't know what benefits it held, but it was going to serve as a lure now. When that rat thing picked up my rapier, it was barely 6 feet away. She dropped this pendant into the hateful puddle. As the silver light wandered beneath the shadow water, she took one step away, then two, measuring out 6 feet. That was the shortest distance necessary to pull off a sword skill. She drew the iron rapier and waited for the moment the sneak thief appeared again. However, it's not coming. A minute had passed, but the shrewman did not show itself. Either she was too close or the lure wasn't valuable enough. But from what Kirito said, the materials all items trick in the beta, the shrewman had appeared from all directions and scooped up every item at his feet. So distance didn't value factor into it. What was the difference about him then and her now? She thought it over, then looked down at the rapier in her hand. After Kirito had pressed the button in his inventory, he wouldn't have had a weapon, so maybe it came down to whether you were waiting a battle or not. She put the rapier back in its sheath at her left side. Within seconds, her boosted hearing detected a little scurrying footsteps on approach. There it is! All her nerves on edge. She readied to draw her sword at any moment. Perhaps the one that appeared wouldn't be the one holding her chivalric rapier, but she'd just have to depend on the good luck for that. But once the footsteps got what it felt like 30 feet away, they stopped moving. It was as if the creature sensed Asuna's bloodthirsty gaze. Actually, couldn't that be the truth in fact? There was no way to be physically sense a gaze on one's skin in the real world, but this place was different. The system knew that Asuna was looking at it, so was the apparatus sending the images to her brain to begin with? So it was perfectly capable of telling the shrewman that she was looking at it. Okay, fine. In that case, she steeled herself and slowly turned around on the spot. Now she was relying solely on her hearing. She placed her hands in her front ears to catch as much sound as possible, training her every nerve on the creature's steps. Plip, plip, plip. As soon as her eyes moved away, the owner of the footsteps moved again. It appeared arithmetically, stopped, approached again, and then she heard it splash lightly into the water. Asunas spun around and drew her rapier. 6 feet away, the sly shrewman had picked up the pendant from the water and was about to flee. The rapier skill Asunas knew with the longest reach was shooting star, but the motion to initiate was complex. And the move took too much time to engage. Here, she would have to use a basic skill with the one with short range but the quickest possible bursts. With a motion she performed so many times, like it was second nature, Asunas pulled out her rapier back. Silver light shone at the tip, enveloping the entire blade. As the system assistants took over, she pushed it forward by launching an extra hard off the ground. Shaking! The one part lower thrust skill, oblique, tore through the darkness of the cave. As the rest of the world moved in slow motion, she saw the glowing white point of the rapier approach the black of the fleeing shrewman, make contact, and just lightly pierce the skin. That was all it took for the HP on its cursor to vanish. With a pathetic little crash and a brief squeak, the little humanoid silhouette burst into countless shards. Just as she landed and stood up again, a little message popped up, listing experience points, coal, and looted items. The XP and money were no big deal. The items were the point, shrewd tail, balloon mushroom, and the unknown necklace she had dropped. That was it. There was no stopping that sigh of lament, but she couldn't give up now. It wasn't clear how many sly shrewmen inhabited in the area at the time, but if she kept hunting them using the same method, she would have to get her rapier back eventually. Asunas stretched then, retrieved the pendant from her inventory again, dropped it into the puddle, and put away her sword and turned around. Over the next 15 minutes, Asunas lured in 3 more shrewmen and dispatched them with a single blow. But the only items they dropped were tail and mushrooms, but no signs of chivalric rapiers. The third even had a wad of paper, just to add insult to injury. She snarled, grinding her teeth as she materialized the paper. She was going to hurl it overhand like a baseball when her arm stopped. Asunas stopped and held the paper up to her face. It seemed like something was written on it. She carefully unwadded the parchment, making sure not to tear it. The standard 7 by 11 inch paper did indeed have a line of text written on it, but the cave was too dark to make it out. Even bringing it close to the glowing moss wasn't enough. So she was about to ball it up again out of frustration when she remembered that Kirito never gave up on the trail like that. She put up her fist to her mouth, trying to calm her rising irritation. Eventually, her mood returned to normal, and she exhaled a long breath. Suddenly, her surprise, a warm light appeared near her hand. She flipped it over and saw that the stone inset atop the ring on her hand was emitting a faint but steady light. She heard Kirito's voice in her ears. "Why don't you equip that? It'll be handy." It was the candle power effect in the ring. Breathing on it made the shine a little bit. He was right. It was handy. She said a silent thanks to her absent partner for ceding that ring to her, then held it closer to the parchment in her other hand. This time, the line writing was clear to see. 29, 2200 hours, B3F, parenthesis, 181, period, 203, parenthesis, period. What is this? She wondered. If it was the start of a quest, the quest log would have chirped with an update the moment she'd read it, but there was no such indicator. So it was a ball of paper a player wrote and threw away, which a shrewman had picked up and treasured. 2200 hours looked like a time, 10 o'clock at night, which meant 29 was the date. The B3F referred to the third basement floor of the catacombs, but the numbers in the parenthesis were still a mystery. While she puzzled it over, the light on the ring faded away, so she breathed on it and held the gem back up to the paper. At that point, she realized it wasn't a period separating the two mystery numbers, but a comma. A little light flickered on in her head, and Asuna muttered, "Are these coordinates?" She had opened up her window and brought up the map of the third floor underground level of the dungeon. When she tapped the cursor and presented the position in mostly unfilled map, it popped up her name and the numbers of her coordinates. It said 181, 235. The coordinates in SAO were by meter, with the 0 point at the upper left corner, meaning that Asuna was currently at 181 meters to the right east of the upper left northwest corner of the dungeon and 235 meters down south. Based on the map size, it looked like a dungeon was about 300 meters side to side, so her current location was somewhere near the middle of the level, though in the lower right quadrant, the X value of the coordinates on the paper was exactly the same, so she'd get the spot by traveling just about 30 meters north from where she currently was. That all added up in her mind, but did not answer what this was referring to, and why a looting mob would be carrying it. She breathed on the ring to recharge the light and held it up to the note. Upon examining the handwritten numbers again, she made a new discovery. In the 203 of the Y coordinate, the 2 looked rather roughly written. It might have been a correction from a mistake, but also looked like a 3. There was a bit of a trick in SEO to writing on parchment with a quill, so it was common for clumsy and unpracticed players to make mistakes. So it was a player who wrote this, then made a mistake and tried to rewrite it, but failed, balled up the paper and threw it away, and the shrewman came along and picked it up. Her partner wasn't around to answer that question for her, but she was pretty sure she was right. The next question was what these coordinates meant. If the writer tried to correct the mistake and was unhappy with the result and used a new parchment anyway, then it wasn't meant for them. And given that it mentioned a time, it was highly likely that the note was indicating a time and place for a meeting. But there were still doubts. Why the need to write on parchment in the first place? That was what instant messages were for. Every mistake could be corrected with the backspace key, and the send button would never deliver instantly. So why not use that? Was it a love letter? No, not in a crude, unsentimental way like this. She glanced at the time indicator in her window. It was 2145 on the 29th. 15 minutes to move just 30 meters. She justified to herself, putting the parchment into her inventory. Asuna headed north down the hallway with her map open, deciding to the thief elimination plan would take temporary break. She crossed about 25 meters without encountering any new monsters and began to hear the faint sound of running water. She squinted and saw that there was little room ahead. A rounded stalagmite rose from the floor like a bench, and the water spouted from an east wall, forming a small spring. She felt a sudden thirst and an urge to rush over and scoop up water to quench it, but she held this in and stood her ground. Her current coordinates were 181230. The little room was undoubtedly the location of the mysterious note writer's meeting. She looked around and found a little hollow in a nearby wall that could serve as a hiding spot and squeezed into it. If a romantic-looking couple ends up coming along, this totally makes me a creepy voyeur, she realized, and briefly wondered what in the world she was doing. But there was no turning back now. She'd put her iron rapier into its sheath and stuck it into the wall. If she had Kismel's invisibility cloak with a 95% hiding rate, or had at least built up her hiding skill, but there was just no use of worrying about it now. 10 minutes passed, leaving just 5 minutes until the meeting of 10 o'clock. She closed her window and lowered her hood of her silk cape, listening intently. A minute later, she heard the footsteps approaching. It wasn't the slapping feet of a sly shrewman, but the crisp ring of hard-soled boots hitting the cave-carven stone. It most certainly belonged to a player. As expected, the steps stopped within the little water cavern. Asuna waited a few moments, then poked her head out of the hollow, glancing at the room 15 feet away. The visitor carried no light, so the only illumination was from the glowing moss, but the room had more of it than the halls, so she could at least make out a figure. All she could tell was that it was short and thin. A hooded cape covered the figure from head to toe, hiding everything else. There was no shape of protruding weapon either, so the person was unarmed or had a small weapon, such as a dagger. Asuna focused hard to bring up a color cursor, but all she saw was that it was green and the HP bar was nearly full. Given that the person had reached the 3rd level of the dungeon alone, it was probably someone from the front line group, but she couldn't identify the name without a better look. If it was someone she knew, she could ask for assistance in getting out, at least. Or that is what she hoped, until the sound of more footsteps hit her ears. A few seconds later, another player entered the room from the north side. This one was also in a hooded cape, but seemed to have a one-handed sword in the left hip. The first player made a hand gesture, like Fleming's left hand rule, with thumb and index and middle finger extended. With the other player returned. The fact that they were communicating with hand signs while wearing full cloaks was quite suspicious. At the very least, it was not lovers on a date, and she had no desire to call out and reveal her presence to them. Asuna realized that her heart had begun to beat wildly, and she put her right hand to her chest. She swallowed hard, feeling the sudden onset of nervous energy coursing through her. The sound of her throat was loud in her ears, and she tensed, worried that it might be overheard. Naturally, the cloaked figures 15 feet away did not hear the beating of her heart nor the swallowing in her throat. They sat on the stalagmite bench against the wall, facing each other. The later to arrive spoke first. Hey, you're here early today. Waiting long? The total lack of care in his voice and the words nearly caused Asuna to slump to her knees. She clung to the wall, listening hard. Not that long, but it was a pain in the ass to get here, said the first player. The high-pitched voice seemed familiar, but it was muffled enough by the hood that she couldn't be sure. The only thing that she could tell was that both seemed to be male. Speaking of pain in the ass, writing down that memo by hand is a royal one. I hate using that damn pen. Can't we just use regular messages? You know we can't. That'll leave a message in your history, you know. Despite the light tone, the contents of the conversation were incredibly suspicious. But that answered the question of why the meeting point wasn't just decided with an instant message, at least. I'm letting things calm down and taking a break from both guilds. If they find out I've been sending messages around, all this trouble will be for nothing. Fine. I get it. Based on the way that they were talking, the first person seemed to be the position of higher authority, given that the second spoke with a kind of informal politeness. But for some reason, Asuna got the opposite impression about them. The second player lowered his volume and muttered, "Just in case. You didn't get trailed, did you? That's why we came here, all the way underground like this, right? Hiding won't work against the astral types on the 2nd level, so anyone following me would get exposed." Yeah, good point. Well, let's get down to business. How did the matter go? The second person asked. Opening his window, he started typing on the hollow keyboard, taking notes. It went pretty well. Our main force is going to break out early before the organized countdown event 2 days from now, and try to just sweep through the labyrinth on its own. Countdown? Asuna wondered to herself as she listened. Then it occurred to her that in 2 days, it would be December 31st, New Year's Eve. A countdown event was certainly possible. The problem was what they said next. Sweeping through the labyrinth meant beating the floor boss, and there were only 2 guilds in Aincrad capable of such a feat, either Lin's DKB or Kabao's ALS, which meant the high-voiced first player was a member of one of the 2 guilds. But a guild's activities and plans were absolutely top secret. If he was coming down here in secret to reveal those to this outsider, that would make him a spy. She mouthed silently, then bit her lip. The first possibility that came to her mind was that the first player, the one who was a DKB/ALS member, was revealing his guild's information to the player with the longsword, who was a member of the other guild. But based on the way he was speaking, it didn't seem like the other one was a member of either group. But who else could possibly want to go to such lengths for internal information on one of the 2 guilds? The only third party she could imagine was Agil and his bro squad, but none of them used a single-handed sword, so they had no reason to engage in spying. Agil had shifted to merchant businesses on the 4th floor when the 5th was already open. It was hard to imagine that he was plotting to sneak past both DKB and ALS to get to the 6th. On the other group was the legend Braves, who had made great strides on the 2nd floor until their scam was exposed and they broke off from the main force. But since they'd had to make amends by handing over all their high-level gear, they probably wouldn't go through such elaborate pains to do this. In fact, it wasn't even that they thought up this trick the scam, but the mysterious stranger in a bar wearing a black poncho. Asuna had to clench her jaw shut to avoid gasping aloud in shock. Kirito's words from the other day before echoed in her mind. There could be 3, 4, or an entire gang of PKers out there in Aincrad somewhere. Could this be it? Was the swordsman who was using the high-voiced cloaked player as a spy to gain guild secrets part of that PK gang Kirito was worried about? In that case, Asuna was in much greater danger at the moment than she'd ever contemplated. She had been nervous earlier, but that was just because she was eavesdropping on a private conversation, and she would feel bad about being exposed. If she lied or apologized about it, she might even get them to help her escape the dungeon. But if they were PKers, murderers, and their important secret contact deep in a dungeon was witnessed by someone else, how would they solve that situation? Threats? Bribery? Or... Her entire body went as cold as ice, freezing her solid. Meanwhile, the lackadaisical second player continued. That sounds nice. Things got a little too soft between Kiba and Lind on the last 2 floors. We gotta stir things up and get them to clash again to keep it from being too boring. Don't act like it's that simple. It's a hell of a job to manipulate a guild meeting into going any particular direction. Yeah, I know, but the boss is training us up on that point to which the super cool conversation technique, you know? True. I think I'm finally getting to the hang of the exact point where I'm not being too obnoxious and talking too much. I've given up on that. Yeah, because the way you talk transcends obnoxious. The first player chuckled and nimbly sat cross-legged atop the stalagmite, rocking back and forth. Still, I can't tell what boss is thinking. I know what he wants to do. It's just so twisted. I think he could get around to it in a much more direct way. We're just sowing the seeds now. Get too hasty and the fun of our little festival will be over in moments. Yeah, I know.
enjoy the process, right?
Exactly. The two chuckled again, and Asuna felt a cold sweat run down her back. Boss. That was the word the two were using to refer to some kind of leader. Perhaps he was the man in the black poncho, the very one who led the braves astray. Kirito's fears were confirmed. At the moment, there was a PK gang of at least 3 members. It's not the kind that just attacks people directly, but one plotting to confuse, agitate, and guide other players into guilds into committing provocation PvP. But why? The massive question came to Asuna's mind again. What did they have to gain by pitting the DKB and the ALS against each other, sowing chaos among the best players in the game? What profit could they derive from that was the greater or the more important than escaping than this game of death? If she had her chivalric rapier in hand, she would leap from her hiding spot and point it at them to demand answers. She would ask them what they were thinking. That momentary impulse shifted her avatar's center of balance forward. The imbalance caused her right foot to step forward an inch or 2. It was enough to rebalance herself, but the edge of her boot kicked a tiny pebble that happened to be resting on the spot. The stone skittered forward, the sound echoing off the cave walls. The chuckles from the room, just 15 feet away, stopped abruptly. Asuna straightened up, pressing her back hard against the wall.
"Did you hear something?" the swordsman whispered.
The first player replied, Maybe it's a mob."
"It wasn't the sound of a monster popping. What's the hallway like down that way?"
"It's a straight shot about 60 meters, then a dead end. If anyone snuck in there, we'd see the cursor. It's a dead giveaway."
But in these natural dungeons, even straight passages have little dips and bends. That would suck if someone heard our little secret convo."
"Oh no, they're coming to check. Even in this darkness, they'll get close enough to see me. I can't win a fight in this starter rapier." She had to think. If her brain was sharp enough to imagine the worst case scenario, she could come up with a plan to get out of this. A number of thoughts burned through her brain in the span of a second, like sparks, eventually forming an idea. Her right hand shot into her pouch, pulling out the piece of parchment with the failed instruction on it. She wadded it up and tossed it softly at her feet. It made no sound. It was just a rolled up piece of paper lying on the ground. Then turned around and urged, "Hurry, hurry, come quick."
"So, I guess I'll check it out," came the swordsman's voice.
She heard him stand. Footsteps approached over the damp cave. 1, 2, 3 steps. Then, "Whoa! What the hell?" the first player shouted at the same time as the screech of a rodent. A sly shrewman had reacted to Asuna's toss of a sheet of paper, running through the little room from the other hallway. "Get the hell out of here!" he yelled, and the swordsman laughed.
"Come on, keep that door on the other end closed, please."
There was a sound of a sheath ringing, then a sword skill. Blue light briefly shone in the passage, and the shrewman screamed. "Stupid rat man! Startling me like that! Must have seen the sound of scurrying around." The sword returned to its sheath, and Asuna let out a silent breath. She crouched and picked up the paper at her feet. Meanwhile, the players continued talking. "Goddamn little annoying looters! Did they show up in the beta too?"
"It was terrible. If you ever dropped your weapon. The best part was that every once in a while you'd lift someone else's nice gear from one, and what do you know? No sooner are the words out of my mouth."
Asuna felt a nasty sensation flooding over her tongue as the swordsman gloated. She heard the sound of an item being materialized, and the smaller player exclaimed in surprise. "Oh, no way! That rapier looks mega rare!" When the full import of this conversation finally permeated her brain for a few seconds, Asuna felt all the blood in her body run cold. "No, it can't be," she pleaded. But there was no other realistic possibility. The very shrewman that Asuna had called over to save from her predicament was the one that had looted her chivalric rapier to begin with. The two men had killed it and gotten her weapon. Now that she had accepted that ugly truth, she tried to remember what would happen to the item's ownership and equipment rights now. She heard Kirito's voice again, repeating his lesson during the second floor upgrade scam uproar. If someone picks up your weapon, or you hand it over to them, the weapons cell in your menu goes blank, including situations like the one where you gave the blacksmiths your wind floret. But here's the thing. The equipment cell might be empty, as though you're not equipping anything. But that Anil Blade's equipper info hasn't been deleted, and the equipment rights are protected much more tightly than simple ownership rights. For example, if I take an unequipped weapon out of storage and give it to you, my ownership of that item disappears. Just 300 seconds. That's 5 minutes. As soon as it goes into someone else's inventory, it's owned by that player. But the length of ownership for an item equipped far longer. It won't be overwritten until either 3,600 seconds have passed or the original owner equips a different weapon in that slot. The original owner equips a different weapon in that slot. That phrase pounded Asuna's brain like a hammer. After her chivalric rapier was looted, she replaced it with an iron rapier in her inventory. At that instant, she had overwritten her equipment rights to the chivalric rapier. Actually, the chances were high that the shrewman had the robbing skill, which eliminated her ownership rights the moment it was looted, and the cloaked swordsman had beaten the shrewman, so the rights of the chivalric rapier were clearly his now, and it had been dropped. Devastated, Asuna slumped against the wall, and meanwhile the first cloaked player was screeching with excitement. "Hey, let me see that! Whoa, it's heavy! Let's look at the specs." "Sure, you gotta be kidding! Check out the attack value! It might as well be a double-handed weapon." "Sounds cool." "Seriously? That's all you have to say? If you're not interested, then give it to me." But you're like a dagger user. Do you even have enough strength?" "If I had a weapon like this, I'd switch from being a fencer. It's called a chivalric rapier. Damn, that's cool." "Who cares what the name is?" "Whoa, it's already been boosted to +5. Asuna fought desperately against the urge to slump down and cover her ears. She'd carelessly fallen into a trap, dropped her sword, the most valuable item she owned, let it be looted by a monster, lost sight of it, then got beaten to the punch by another player. She had no right to that weapon, and she knew it. But she couldn't give it up now. She just couldn't. These PK gang members used it. That chivalric rapier might take a player's life, a person's life. She couldn't possibly stand that. She would emerge from her hiding spot and beg them to sell it back to her. Even if it meant revealing that she'd been eavesdropping on their secrets, they turned their weapons on her. This was to protect others from what they might do to the chivalric rapier. Asuna took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage. She peeked out a bit from the hollow, looking closely at the players, turning away from her, one holding her beloved weapon. She willed the strength into her legs, trembling with nerves and fear, preparing to step out into the hallway. At that moment, the darkness of the hallway on the north side of a little spring room wavered like a watery surface, producing another figure clad in black. "Huh?" sputtered the rapier-holding player as the swordsman tensed, but Asuna barely even noticed what the two cloaked players were doing. The new member of the scene wore a long black leather coat. A beautiful designed longsword hung across his back. Beneath his long black bangs burned eyes darker than darkness. The sight was so vivid on her virtual retinas that she couldn't even blink. "Well, well, well," said the second cloaked player, still as lackadaisical as before, but in a much colder tone. "I always seem to run into you in the funniest of places." The first cloaked player's shoulders tensed as he prepared to shout something, but the second one struck him in the chest with the back of his hand to shut him up. He stepped forward to hide his partner's identity and growled at the newcomer. mind if I ask one question? How long have you been there?
I just got here, heard you two talking, said the black-clad swordsman at last, his familiar voice almost causing Asuna to wilt to the ground with relief. But this was not the time to lose her composure. If needed, she might be leaping out of her hiding spot to come to her partner's aid.
Well, wouldn't you know it? I thought we were keeping it nice and quiet from the main hall, but I guess we got carried away once I acquired this nice rare loot.
About that weapon. You said it was a chivalric rapier +5, right? You sure about that?
Wow, you seem to have latched onto that detail just from hearing it said once. What about it, pal? Asked the second cloaked player, spreading his hand theatrically in the challenge.
The other swordsman in black answered coldly, "My partner was using that rapier."
The first player abruptly budged, and again the second one silenced him with the back of his hand. He really did not want his partner to say anything. Once he was convinced that the other player would reluctantly remain silent, the second made a theatrical gesture of confusion. Oh, is that so? Well, I just looted it off this looter mob. So, do I have this situation right? You want me to return your friend's weapon?
No, I am not going to get it in your case about that. It's just, I have no way of judging if your words are the truth or not.
The black-haired swordsman stepped forward, slightly, his voice quiet but chilling. After all, you could have gotten that sword by dual PKing my partner, right, Morte? Called out by name. The second cloaked player raised his left hand and slowly pulled his hood back. What emerged was a metal coif, its hem ragged. He shook it, clinking the threaded chains, and laughed in different tone of voice than what he'd been using previously. All right, I see your tactic here. You mean the way I did to you on the third floor, Kirito? Asuna could sense that once the two men called each other by name, the cave grew very, very tense. Neither had drawn his weapon, but she could practically see sparks between them. Morche. The man wearing the coif was very same the dual PKer who had challenged Kirito to a half-finish mode duel on the third floor. And then, just before taking him to the halfway point that would end him, the duel attempted a huge critical hit to kill him. The swordsman, one in the black coat, the one wearing a black cloak, stared at each other down in silence. Even the raucous, chatty dagger, the user was bowed back, intimidated into holding his tongue by the scene. Asuna was still partnered with Kirito, so he would see next to his own HP bar that Asuna still had about 90% of her HP left. His challenge was that she might have been dueled PK'd for her sword was just a bluff, yet the sheer pressure of exuding from his entire body made him seem deadly serious. Meanwhile, Morche wielded his own atmosphere of sheer murder, not backing down a single step. She was certain that if either of them drew his blade, a battle would result, and not a duel. Whoever landed the first hit would become an orange player, unable to enter town until his cursor returned to green status. But both of them had to know that. Each understood the other as a foe whose defeat was worth that heavy cost. However, by the act of Akihio Kayaba, the creator of Sword Art Online, the game was no longer normal. It was a cold, cruel game of death, in which the loss of all HP meant the loss of the actual player's life. PKing was no longer just PKing. It was true murder. She couldn't let Kirito's hands be stained with blood over something that began with her own mistake. She had to resolve the situation before they turned to battle. There was probably only one thing she could do: retrieve her chivalric rapier from the first cloaked player through means other than battle. At the very least, that would remove Kirito's need to attack Morche, given that they knew the rapier's incredible power, they would hesitate to begin a 2-on-2 fight. The first player had his back to her, unaware of her presence. If this was the real world, she would just sneak up and snatch the rapier out of his hands. But it wasn't clear if stealing an item that forcefully would work in this world. Plus, just wrestling it out of his fingers wouldn't override Morche's system-ordained ownership. Yes, the floating castle of Ironcrad was ruled by absolute laws of the game system. Laws that didn't exist in the real world. The most important tool for survival was to understand the system and make it work for you. What could she do completely and entirely to recover Chivalric Rapier? She needed to physically possess the item, then later reset ownership rights. There was no other way. But she would need to have the item for 300 seconds for that to work. It was a very long period of time, and it would not be a simple matter of just snatching out of the first player's hand. Meanwhile, Asuna's right eye and ear took note of two phenomena simultaneously. Her eye saw the first player's left hand searching for a weapon on his left hip. Her ear heard the slight swish of a monster popping into being on the south side of the hallway, the direction of the spot where she first fell. The two things combined in a chemical reaction, guiding her to a single strategy. It wasn't a sure thing, and it wouldn't be dangerous, but she couldn't think of a better idea on the spot. Kirito and Morche were staring at each other silently, gauging how the other might react, but the impatient first player would be the first to explode. Then the battle could not be stopped. If she was going to act, she needed to act now. Asuna sucked in a cold breath into her lungs and tensed. The first player flipped aside his cloak with his left hand, exposing a dagger. At that precise moment, Asuna dropped the ball of paper from her hand again. Instantly, little footsteps began approaching from the south. In order to free up his hand, the first player tried to move the rapier to his left. Just as the sheath was about to move from hand to hand, Asuna leaped out of her hiding spot, drew her iron rapier, and expended all the air charged in her lungs into a deafening scream. The scream was so loud it brought down a patter of sand from the walls. The unnamed cloaked player and Morte both jumped. The chivalric rapier slipped out of the cloaked man's hand and fell to the ground. In less than a second, it was not Asuna, Morche, or the cloaked player who darted forth to snatch the weapon, but the freshly arrived sly shrewman. As the rodent tried to turn around and slip away, Asuna hit it with an oblique, her fastest sword skill. The monster's body burst into blue shards, and the rapier it was carrying disappeared. She jumped as far back as she could and opened her equipment screen. In the main weapon cell, she replaced the iron rapier with the weapon that had just dropped. The rapier in her right hand vanished into light, and reassuring weight appeared in her left waist. Just over 3 seconds had passed from the monster she leapt out from her hiding spot. By the time she landed, Asuna had already drawn the chivalric rapier +5. It was much heavier than the iron rapier, but the hilt formed around her hand like it was absorbing it. Now that her weapon was once again physical and systematically in her possession, she held it out before her. The situation was still a dangerous one. But for a moment, Asuna caught sight of her partner's face between the two cloaked men. Even Kirito was briefly startled, but he recovered at once, grinning and nodding. The first to speak was the original cloaked player, who still didn't understand what just happened. What the? Where did you? That came from? It was a high-pitched falsetto screech. Morche extended his left hand to cover up the mouth of the other player, with what was poking out a bit from the hood as he turned around. Asuna made sure to stare with all her might at the face of the piqueur as she caught sight of it for the first time. She couldn't see much past the hanging chains of his coif in the dim light of the moss, but she could make out some general features. He had a pointed chin and thin lips pulled to one side in a snarl. She burned the image, like that of a joker in a pack of cards, into her retinas. His lips glistened, curving wettily into a sneer that hid cold steel.
Scared by a little boo? First Blackie, now you. Y'all like to jump out of nowhere. And how long were you hiding over there? She wanted to shout that she'd overheard the entire thing, but she decided better of it when she saw Kirito shaking his head at her over Morche's shoulder. What's wrong? Cat got your tongue? You scared a good 3 seconds of my life with that stunt. I think you owe me one. The other player yanked his hand out of Morche's way. He moved it to the dagger at his waist, tracing the gleaming hilt, and screeched in a voice like rusted metal. Listen, I'm really pissed off right now. Is this really the time to stand around and chit-chat? We gotta react under the assumption that they heard everything. Morche shrugged his shoulders in exasperation. Impatience will get you nowhere, you know. Besides, you saw that rapier stats, didn't you? Assuming I take on Blackie over here, do you really think I can handle that on your own? Don't insult me. I can tackle PvP an amateur girl like her. The first player spat. Asuna realized her breathing had picked up, but only until she heard the next line. Besides, I can't go home after having my badass rapier stolen lucky ruse. Since when did this sword belong to you? You called it chivalric. She thought it furiously, as all hesitation gone. Perhaps screaming the way she did wasn't exactly the politest of tactics, but it certainly wasn't a stroke of luck. Asuna aimed for that moment based on a specific, precise logic. She was certain that the piece of parchment that guided her to this point was written and discarded by the first player. Messing up on the simple act of writing a number was, if not the act of someone with FNC, full dive nonconformity disability. At least the sign of trouble with fine finger movements in a full dive. In short, proof of clumsiness. If she startled him at the very moment he moved the weapon from one hand to the other, he would surely drop it. That was her reasoning for shouting like that. And she made it so looting Shrew would pick up the rapier so that she could kill it, thus ensuring the sword was officially back in her possession. She would never let it go again, and could fight another player to protect her precious weapon. Asuna pointed to the tip of her chivalric rapier forward in display of that will. The first cloaked player clicked his tongue and squeezed the handle of the dagger. But at that point, the situation took an unexpected turn. In the back, Kirito turned and raced past Morche's left side, straight for Asuna. As Asuna leaned back in surprise, he grabbed her around the breastplate and leaped into the hollow where she'd been hiding. He pressed her flat against the wall, covering her with his coat, activating the hiding skill. Obviously, this was not actually going to hide them, but the next moment, Asuna heard the reason why Kirito had done it. From the north hallway came a great many sounds of clanging metal, the sign of a group of monsters. But why so suddenly? And then it hit her. Of course, it would be strange for such a thing not to happen in a dungeon after the way she shouted. She couldn't see the cloaked men anymore, but she heard the first one hiss, Shit, they bought a bunch of mobs down to the MPK us, the dirty bastards. Coming for you, Morche laughed. But it was not as confident and cocky as before. She heard them drawing their weapons. But as the monsters approached, his order to his comrade was tense and worried. Never mind. It'll suck fighting this many of them. We ought to pull back. Tss. Fine. Whoops. That's a dead end down there. We gotta sprint to the staircase. So do what you do best to keep up, bud. Hey, wait! The two sets of footsteps raced away, eventually eclipsed by raucous pursuit of the monsters. The sounds gradually died away, and disappeared at last. Silence. No, not quite. There was one sound left, tirelessly throbbing in her ears in a bass register, the sound of her heart. The sound of blood rushing from her virtual heart. Or perhaps it was her real heart, beating so loudly it got through to her ears. As she listened, the pulse slowed calmly,
gradually pulling her away from the absolute state of tension. For a moment, she felt her wits grow distant, and she nearly dropped her rapier, but she wouldn't never let that happen again. She willed the strength into her fingers and returned the sword into its sheath from her spot beneath the coat that covered her body. In response to that action, Kirito let out a long breath and prepared to stand up from his crouch over Asuna. But she unconsciously lifted her right hand, pulling on his left as he rose. There, right within reach of her arms, was reassuring presence of her partner. Yes, it was all right now. There was nothing to fear. Asuna trembled powerfully, overcome by the sudden upsurge of all the emotions that had been pressed and compacted inside of her from the moment she fell through the trap door. Heat gathered in her eyes, and something roiled up in her throat. The strength went out in her knees, and she nearly slumped down to the floor. But Kirito, hand propped her back. His voice said in her ear, "You did well. I'm glad you're all right." Those words permeated in her mind instantly, removing all self-control. The demand that she had to be the strongest, the admonition that she was always getting help, and the fear that if she showed any weakness, she would be left behind. All these emotions were temporarily set loose, and she pressed her head against Kirito's chest. Through trembling lips, she blurbered like a young child. "I was so scared. I was so scared." She squeezed her eyes shut, letting her emotions do the speaking. "There was this ghost, and I fell into a pit, then I got lost, and I dropped my rapier, and I thought I was done for. I thought I was going to meet my end in this horrible dark cave. I was so scared. I really mean it." Her whole body was trembling intermittently. She clutched at Kirito's shirt, craving direct, if virtual, contact. Suddenly, a pleasing, gentle sensation enveloped her. Kirito was rubbing the top of Asuna's head. He repeated awkwardly but heartfelt motion over and over. "It's all right. You're all right," he whispered, barely audible. But the steadfast will contained in those words were more trustworthy than anything else in this world. "If we ever split up again, I'll find you and come help. You're my partner, Asuna." "Yeah." Like the flipping of a switch, Asuna stopped trembling, but she didn't let go of him, and Kirito didn't stop rubbing her head. They kept a long, silent embrace in a little corner of the catacomb dungeon.